Hi, welcome to Empower. I'm Dr. Stacy Sims. I want to get into a little bit of the background of menopause, what it is and why women are experiencing so many changeable aspects within their body. We hear a lot about common interventions to stop vasomotor symptoms, night sweats, mood disorder, body composition change, and we hear a lot in the media right now about menopause hormone therapy, non-hormone options like a serotonin reuptake inhibitor or other kind of medications you can take. We also have complementary alternatives such as adaptogens. You might hear about maca or rhodiola or ashwagandha and how you should be taking this to help with menopausal symptoms. But the one thing that's significantly lacking in these conversations is one of the most empowering interventions there is, and that is exercise with your nutrition. This is something that is overlooked and such an empowering aspect for women who are in peri and postmenopausal to take on board, to actually be able to instigate change and take control back to their life. So let's talk a little bit about what we need to do for our active women who are going through peri into postmenopause. We need to look at doing some high intensity interval training, some heavy resistance training, and of course, really focusing on what kinds of food we need to eat and when we need to eat it. Specifically with an eye to lots of colorful fruit and veg and some protein. But let's take a step back for a minute. Right now, we hear about the 150 minutes of moderate intensity exercise that's good for overall health. If you're not moving at all, this is a place to start. But when we're specifically looking at active women who are not finding any kind of change, even though they're putting in the work for their training, and they're not seeing any kind of adaptation, there's no help for body composition, they don't feel like they're getting stronger, and they're kind of putting their hands up going, what is going on? It's because these traditional methods of 150 minutes of just moving is not adequate to invoke any kind of change. We see that these traditional methods of 10 to 12 repetitions for our weightlifting, not adequate to improve our muscle strength. It's not adequate to keep our lean mass. It's also not adequate to change our body composition. Doing zone 2 training, definitely not beneficial for changing our body composition. So these traditional methods that we hear so much about are really not appropriate for this specific active population that is peri into postmenopause. Why? Let's dig into that for a little bit, shall we? So if we look at what exactly is happening, if we think about puberty and when our girls are going through puberty, it's really the expression of estrogen and progesterone that's invoking all of these changes. We're seeing biomechanical changes, we're seeing body composition changes, we're seeing mood changes, and then we get the menstrual cycle. Well, now when we're in perimenopause into postmenopause, we're on the other end of that. So instead of increasing our estrogen and progesterone, we're starting to see a flat lining of these hormones. So what happens when we have this flat lining of our hormones? We see an increase in our total body inflammation because the body is under a significant amount of stress. We often hear that as elevated cortisol causing inflammation. Yes and no. Our body is under a lot of stress because our sex hormones, our estrogen and progesterone, are no longer working the way they used to. So yes, the body is under increased stress. We have an increased amount of baseline cortisol, and that can cause some total body inflammation. But if we look at how we can invoke some different interventions to bring that down, that body inflammation decreases. We do know that there's an increase in insulin resistance. So this means that we have a little bit of a misstep in our resting blood sugar and the way that our body uses blood sugar, and this can contribute to some of that increased body fat that we start to find. Unfortunately, we see as we get older, this isn't necessarily just because of perimenopause, but as we get older, our body tends to store more fat. It doesn't necessarily use more of it, but it definitely stores more of it. And there isn't the impetus to get rid of it. But again, if we're looking specifically at what kind of interventions that we can do from an external standpoint with exercise, then we can mitigate that as well. We also see, because we're having that flat lining of progesterone, We're also seeing a reduced stimulus for bone turnover. So that means that our bones aren't getting a stimulus to get new bone cells over and over. So we start to see a decrease in our bone mineral density. And then, of course, we know that estrogen and to some extent progesterone is directly related to how serotonin, norepinephrine, and our dopamine are all affecting our brain. We start to see changes in our mood. We start to see changes in how we focus, our ability to react. So when we look at these as symptomology of perimenopause, and we're told to do exercise to improve this, we really have to be specific what kind of exercise we are doing to kind of, counter this flatlining of hormones. So as we go into it specifically, estrogen is really specific to our strength and our overall amount of muscle mass, our lean mass. So when we start to have a decrease in our estrogen, we have a decrease in the basic signaling, what we call satellite cell signaling. So this is your basic muscle cell. We have a decrease in the signaling to actually create more muscle cells. Some people go, well, I'm on menopause hormone therapy, so that counters it. But we know that the estrogen component of menopause hormone therapy does not improve the signaling. It slows the rate of loss, but it doesn't directly affect this satellite cell or this basic signaling to increase lean mass. So we see that it just slows the rate of strength, and it also slows the rate of overall lean mass loss, but it doesn't stop it. The other thing that we find with the decrease in estrogen and progesterone is we have a misstep in our gene expression. So when we're looking at genes either turn on or off the ability of the skeletal cell to kind of say, yes, I'm really robust and healthy, let's keep going. Or I'm starting to get very old and I need to die, so to speak, or I need to be regenerated into another new cell. So when we have a decrease in estrogen and progesterone, we start to lose the signaling for this expression to get rid of old skeletal muscle cells and to increase the ability to create new ones. This is why we start to see the significant drop in strength and power and a change in our body composition. The other thing that estrogen is really responsible for is myosin. So if we think about the way that a muscle contracts, and we see that it contracts by grabbing on and sliding together, so this is a strong muscle contraction. One of the things that really pulls these muscle fibers together is a protein called myosin. Myosin combines with actin to kind of bond together to pull those filaments or those muscle fibers together to create that strong contraction. So when estrogen starts to drop or change in the amount that's circulating in the body, how strong that myosin bonds to actin, it decreases in its strength. So we don't have as strong a muscle contraction. So we see that as a loss of strength and power in perimenopausal and postmenopausal women. We also, again, see that estrogen will be responsible for increasing muscle mass. So when we lose it, we're also losing that muscle fiber. And so you're also losing the ability to have those muscle fibers contract because there's not as many of them. And also when we see a decrease in progesterone and estrogen here, we see that there's a reduction in what we call a synaptic transmission. So this is about your nerve and your nerve impulse. So when you have to lift something heavy and the brain perceives it as a stress per se, it sends nerve signalings down to recruit as many fibers as possible. But before that nerve can actually reach the muscle fiber, it has to jump this little, what we call gap junction. And it goes across that gap junction with what we call acetylcholine. This is a neurotransmitter. And estrogen and progesterone are tightly tied to how this neurotransmitter, acetylcholine, is being stored in that little gap. So we have a decrease in acetylcholine, then we have a decrease in the way that the nerve transmission can actually jump that little gap and make those fibers contract. So again, with the flatlining of these hormones, we're losing strength and power because we're having a dysfunction in the way muscle is being created, as well as the signaling for it to contract and have a strong contraction. So what do? We need to actually find an external stress. And in this regard, we mean exercise and changing up the kind of exercise that we were doing. Because in this transition, this perimenopause into postmenopause, the body needs an external stress that's going to cause a positive adaptation the way estrogen and progesterone used to support. So this is looking at heavy lifting so that we are invoking a central nervous system response to lift that load and have more muscles contract. We're looking at high intensity workouts to really create a conversation between the muscle and the fat tissue to tell the fat tissue to disappear and to increase the way your body uses carbohydrates. So we're not relying so much on insulin. So we need those external stressors through different modes and mechanisms of exercise to create this adaptation the way these hormones used to support us. So this brings us to what kinds of modes of exercise do we really want to focus on? The bedrock of everything is heavy resistance training. We say lift, heavy stuff. We also have high intensity interval training. Now there's a subset of high intensity interval training called SIT or sprint interval training. That doesn't mean running sprints, it just means very high intensity work. And we'll get to that shortly. And then the last thing is about explosive power. And this is more your box jumps, your plyometric jump training. And it doesn't necessarily have to be pure jumping, but it's about how fast we move to keep that central nervous system and those muscles firing in a fast rate so we don't lose our power and our strength. So let's look a little bit closer. So if we're looking at why we need to do this, if we think about strength and power and the way that we're starting to lose this, again, we have that focus on heavy resistance training. What does that mean? That means we're looking for low reps with a heavy weight. So this is where we're getting away from that 10 plus reps of 3 to 4 sets, and we're going more for 3 to 6 reps of 80% or more of our maximum. Why we want to do that is we want to really stimulate the central nervous system to create that pathway to maintain strength and power and to give that signaling to keep our muscles being strong and powerful, as well as to put some stress, multi-directional stress, on the bones to signal the bones that yes, we need to be strong, so let's turn some of those older cells over and get new ones and be super strong and build our skeletal system. The next thing about power is plyometrics, that jump training. This is all about explosive movement. How do we generate force? And this is one of the first things that goes as we start to get into later perimenopause into postmenopause. And the other consideration here for strength and power is pelvic floor health. The pelvic floor muscles are muscles, and they too are affected by the changing of our estrogen, how much we have. So we start to see more incontinence, we start to see more issues with the pelvic floor. So we have to do a little bit of retraining of the pelvic floor and really make sure that we have really dialed in the ability to contract and relax the pelvic floor before we start adding lots of load. Otherwise, it will perpetuate some dysfunction. When we're talking about endurance, this is where we see a lot of people going a little bit awry of focusing more on steady state work, moderate intensity work, because they've heard 150 minutes of moderate intensity activity. But as I said earlier, this does not work for our peri and postmenopause population. We need to focus on intensity. And what I mean by intensity is high intensity interval training where we have an interval that's 1 to 4 minutes long, sitting between 80 and 85% of your max, or an 8 on your rating of perceived exertion of a scale of 0 to 10. And this is more for your cardiovascular and brain health. We know that high intensity work really helps with our blood vessels, it helps with our heart muscle, it helps get rid of the plaque that might be accumulating for cardiovascular disease. And then we need that high intensity work to produce lactate to really carry over for brain metabolism and brain health. The subset of our high intensity interval training is sprint interval training. Now, sprint interval training is an interval that is 5 to 30 seconds, and it is as hard as you can go for those 5 to 30 seconds. And on a scale of 1 to 10, it's sitting between that 9 and 10. So you are full gas. And the reason for that is you start to have changes within the muscle itself that pulls glucose in without insulin. And it also produces more what we call exerkines, which are hormones that the skeletal muscle releases that has what we call crosstalk. So it tells the visceral fat, that deep abdominal fat and body fat, that, hey, we don't need you. So it's a signaling for less accumulation of that body fat and to keep that lean mass. What we do need to do is have less focus on that long, slow, steady state stuff and have less zone 2, if at all. So the zone 2 fits into recovery days, but it's not the bread and butter here. So let's go through this first module, shall we? What are our key points? So we know that with the changes of estrogen and progesterone, and we're having more of a flat line, but first we have a change in those ratios, and then progesterone really starts to decrease, estrogen starts to decrease. We see every system of the body being affected. So in order to keep progressing and to get fitter and to change our body composition and maintain brain health and bone and lean mass, we need to look to an external stress. Really different types of exercise stress to create a response within the body the way estrogen and progesterone used to do. Specifically, we want to look at heavy resistance training to stimulate the central nervous system to build and maintain that lean mass. We need high intensity interval training to improve insulin resistance, to improve our blood vessels, to improve our overall cardiovascular health, as well as brain health. And in this, high intensity interval training is that sprint interval training that really goes far in reducing that visceral fat gain. We know that moderate intensity exercise is not really ideal for this population here, but it can be incorporated for specific endurance race training if you're gearing up for a 10K run or something longer and you need time on your feet. There's a time and a place to put that long, slow stuff in. But when we're looking at the peri into postmenopausal group, we want to really downplay the volume and increase that quality intensity. Because these two things here, coupled with nutrition that we'll talk about shortly, is the biggest tool in your toolbox for really taking control of the changes that are occurring during peri and postmenopause.